Despite the fact that the South African agricultural sector is under considerable external pressure, it still contributes impressively to our country's economy. Ask anybody in the sector if they should consider a career in agriculture. Most would say you're making an excellent choice. Now, today we'll be discussing all the factors that contribute or impact job creation in the agricultural sector. And I'd like to welcome Thuli Sikosana from Agri SA. We've got Tioboso from AgBiz and Dr. Roelof Botha. He's from the Optimum Investment Group. Thuli, the latest quarterly labour force survey results demonstrate the good contribution of the agricultural sector towards the country's economy. Would you share a few numbers with us?
Yes, thank you so much. So right now, when we're looking at the latest stats that were released, the latest stats came out, I believe, in around March or April. They were just measuring the performance of agriculture from the quarter 4, 2022, to the first quarter through to 2023. Now, in terms of the GDP contribution, agriculture is performing at a GDP contribution of 1.5% to the economy. And then if you're looking at job creation, we saw an increase in creation of jobs in the agricultural sector. It is estimated that the contribution in terms of the employment, agriculture is around about approximately, and I'll say roughly, because it is about data at the end of the day, is contributing at 5.4% to the employment in the workforce. It is reflected further in the Stats SA report that we increased around 27,000 jobs. So that is an increase of about 3.4% on average if you look at it from that perspective. So that means that there is a contribution to the GDP. That's the first thing. And markedly, secondly, there is an increase of people that we are employing.
Good news, after all. Theo, we've got a few industries within the agricultural sector. Which industries perform the best with regards to job creation?
Yes, the industries do obviously differ, the nature of them. Some mechanization plays a bigger role than others. Some are more labor intensive. So broadly speaking, if you look at there's 4 real big groupings, if I can put it that way. There's the agro-processing as well as input suppliers, which is more in the value chain, and they typically employment figures might be lower than primary agriculture, but typically those are higher skilled, higher paid jobs. And then within primary agriculture, if you look at the 3 commodity clusters, of course the livestock cluster, field crops cluster, as well as the horticultural cluster, and I would add wine as well into horticulture. Typically, the latter is the most labor-intensive one. It's where the bulk of agricultural jobs are created, and that's why also reflected in the provinces that contribute the most to agricultural employment. And if you simply look at the performance over the last year or so, and actually even going back before that, a lot of the GDP growth over the last 3 years and the good performance has been on field crops. Bolstered by very good climatic conditions, good prices, of course. There are challenges, which I'm sure we'll also discuss a bit later, relating to input costs and other elements. But broadly speaking, that's one of the less labor-intensive one. But again, the dynamics are interesting because in the field crop sector, for instance, whilst there might be less job creation than specifically the horticultural sector, many of those are semi-skilled jobs. Operators of highly complicated machinery, for instance. So it's quite a dynamic sector. I still believe, as you mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities, but of course there are a number of things that we need to get right to unlock the potential of the sector to create jobs.
Dr. Roelof, the reason why you're here is to give us a national perspective on things. We've got 2 people here from the agricultural sector, but let's look at employment nationally. It's actually increased, which is also good news. What does the survey results show, and what are the main factors that influence unemployment?
Yes, on a national level, last year was actually stunning. We created 1.4 million jobs, and obviously not all of them in agriculture, but the fact is that the 1.5% contribution to GDP, what one should add to that is the processed food sector. So if you take the primary agricultural GDP contribution through all the value chains, then it's much closer to 25 to 30% range. Fact of the matter is that there's no substitute for food. You cannot eat your mobile phone or your laptop. And we are the most food secure country on this continent. So quite frankly, I don't think there is remotely enough appreciation amongst South Africa's government for what South African farmers have to go through. There is zero incentive to farm in this country. Apart from trying to make a living and on the odd occasion a profit, it's a passion amongst farmers, and it has become so diversified. To add to what Theo just said, it's a dynamic and extremely diversified sector, and there are so many job opportunities from very low skills to medium skills to research and development, where you can sit in a laboratory. It's a fascinating sector in its totality. And of course, strategically important. Other countries, in France, I've been told that whether you farm or not, you get 40% kickback from the government. I mean, this is just crazy. They should really look after our sector a little bit better. The fact of the matter is the 1.4 million new jobs that have been created, those people eat food. Well, I hope so. So agriculture has certainly benefited if you look at it from the demand side, even though the economy is under strain because of the Reserve Bank's weird, hawkish monetary policy. People are still, retail sector is still doing quite well. Wholesale sector in real terms, new record sales levels in the first quarter of this year. So the economy has taken a knock because of inflation and high interest rates, but it's up and running, and the best news possible. This is hot off the press. As the viewers would appreciate, is inflation has come down quite significantly to just above the Reserve Bank's target range. This is very good news because it means interest rates can start dropping, and that can take pressure off our farmers.
Mm-hmm. So what factors contribute to unemployment? What would you list?
Okay, sorry, I got sidetracked a little bit.
Yes, you
there,
did.
As usual. Okay, this is terribly important, quite frankly, because we have a highly over-regulated economy right now. The number of permits and licenses and forms that you have to fill in to do more or less anything in this country is just absolutely unbelievable. So if they can take a hiatus on any minimum wage increases in future, it's just amazing that they find it in themselves to pay 350 Rand a month to unemployed people. That's the COVID grant, which is half of the minimum food level. But farmers who are battling with rising costs are expected to pay multiples of that for people that do not necessarily always add significant value. So really the minimum wages have got absolutely no place in a developing economy in this continent. I'm not aware of any other country in this continent that has remotely our level of minimum wages. And then, of course, the infrastructure, the state of the roads outside of the Western Cape. And the beauty of the Western Cape is it has shown us that if you have accountable government and accountable municipalities that have mastered the art of fixing a pothole, then you can actually have good transport modes. There's a new emphasis. Government has admitted its incompetence to so large extent in this area by having just now formed the National Logistics Crisis Committee. Listen to the words, crisis committee. The beauty of this is the private sector is becoming involved. So I am full of confidence for the future.
Thank you. We'll see if the Western Cape can live up to their promises after the floods. Theo, what are the factors that threaten jobs in the agricultural sector?
I think many of them are cross-cutting. The same issues that affect the rest of the economy, exactly like Doc has mentioned now. And it's interesting making that link with food price inflation. I think it's great news that it's coming down now. But if you looked at what happened in the past year, whilst globally speaking, food price inflation was, I think, steadied a little bit quicker than South Africa, and to a large extent that can come down to the additional costs that the value chain need to absorb in South Africa. Two of those I already mentioned. I mean, energy, certainly that's a big one. All the entire economy, all the businesses are struggling with it, but it adds the additional layer of costs. So the sector has been able to cope very well in terms of we haven't seen any food shortages, That risk has been maintained or mitigated to a large extent, but it's additional cost through burning diesel in generators, etc. And all of that does affect the balance sheet of companies. Likewise with logistics, and that's why I think it's no surprise we have a national crisis committee for both energy and logistics, because those two are really enormously big ones. South Africa, we don't have navigable, rivers that you can navigate on. It's a large country. Typically, a lot of the production areas are quite far removed from where some of the consumers are, or even for export, you're from the coastal regions where you can export. So the costs are naturally going to be a little bit higher. But some of the unique factors that also I think are almost own goals is the fact that our rail system is not working optimally, and that's certainly something that one has to look at the crisis committee. And likewise, 52% in value terms of our products are exported, and these are value chains where the South African agriculture and agribusiness sectors are highly competitive. We have a good product that we can export, and there's a demand for the product globally. But again, it has to go through the ports. So having that sufficient capacity and well-functioning capacity assists a lot. So when you do use road transport, especially with the state and some of the provincial roads, which are also not what they should be, all of that adds additional layers of cost. And I think that is starting to trickle down. Some of the more specific factors to our industry, the national minimum wage was mentioned. So agriculture is now equalized with the rest of the economy, meaning that our national minimum wage is now the same as the rest of the economy. We did have that 9.6% jump recently, but the preceding year it was a 14% jump as agriculture the agricultural minimum wage had to catch up with the rest of the economy. It started at an 80% rate. So essentially having two near double-digit increases in consecutive years, that's bound to play a specific role. And I think in the debate, there is a human side to it that you have to consider. Obviously, the intention and what one does want to work towards eventually is having your workforce well remunerated. But there is that fine line between individual remuneration versus job creation. And I think one of the scary aspects that we might be heading towards, and this is something that I think certainly needs to be looked at and considered, and it's some tough decisions that need to be made. Do we want a situation where you've got 3 low-income earners in one household, supporting a household? Or do you want to have quite a high minimum wage, but one person in that whole household having sustained 5 or 7 people? And I think these are the tough decisions that we need to face, and these are the challenges, I think, impacting the agricultural sector employment.
We have to move on, Thuli. I'd like to focus on load shedding. That is, I know Agri-SA recently expressed their concern with the impact that load shedding has on agricultural jobs and job creation in agriculture.
Yes.
Can you share some figures with us and how labour intensive these sectors actually are that is impacted by load shedding?
I think in a general scope of it, Agri-SA and Agbiz are actually in agreement in one thing. There was an article that was done by one of our colleagues at Agbiz actually, and it was actually in direct alignment with what was published by our CEO. And he was talking about the horticulture sector, and he was talking about the fact that due to dry conditions, right, soybeans, for example, is just one of the commodities. I think about roughly 35%, if not 40% of soybeans are dependent on irrigation. So if you have got a load shedding schedule and you have got workers that you schedule to take in, so for example, some of the farmers will have agro housing, they'll have agro transportation, and then during that time they also have to comply with basic conditions of Employment Act. So that says that if you are working over a particular amount of hours, you have to pay overtime. So if your schedule in terms of the grid that you're operating on, and I'm not even going to go into when you actually have to try and firstly apply to be removed off the grid. I'm not going to go into those costs and whether or not you are actually eligible to actually go off the grid, because there's even a discussion around that in the task team. We're just going to keep it to the basics of labor. If you're saying, I'm going to employ you and you have to pick fruit, I'm just going to give you a simple example, and I have to irrigate that fruit. I have to make sure, and now you're dealing with vast areas of land. So if I have an irrigation system, it has to cover a certain amount of land or hectares. So that will mean that if there is no power for me to do that, it either I get alternative energy, which is going to be your diesel. If I cannot even afford that for some reason or other, that means that I have to actually get my workers to come back or even stay back at longer times. That will now disrupt my entire schedule of actual production, which will inevitably have a direct impact on the quality of the food that you're producing. Number two, the impact costs. So that means if I'm buying diesel, if I'm paying to get off the grid, and then I have to wait and say, if let's say, for example, because now you're farming late in the evening, something happens to one of your workers, you now have to have that COIDA a discussion where you're taking someone to the doctor, you have to pay those out of your own pocket. So there's so many implications of this thing, and I don't think that we fully appreciate this. And then at the same time, there's this discussion of mechanization. Like we said, if certain industries decide that in certain times that they're going to mechanize and they're going to use, for example, solar panels in order for them, there's a new innovation by one of the companies where they're actually bringing up a new technology where you can actually irrigate at a certain time of the night. You just set it up and then you have that absorbed by solar and it goes. We're losing jobs. So where do we strike the balance? How do we do this without the partnership of government?
Let's talk about a solution. Dr. Roelof, can we target or can we in some way have relief from load shedding? I know some of the other industries like the schools and the hospitals have applied for relief and they said it's impossible. What is the solution here? What is your recommendation?
Well, in the short term, we must just hope that they fix those chimneys at Kusile. And we've circumvented some environmental laws to get there. And this is quite important because it tells you that President Ramaphosa, through some appointments that he's made recently within the presidency, are doing things at a faster pace than some of the national government departments are doing at this point in time. Also, getting back to the crisis committees, there's a strong private sector involvement now. CEOs from major companies have come to the party on request, and they are prepared. Apparently, I'm assuming it will be through the secondment of experts to assist people in the public sector who do not necessarily have the experience and the qualifications to do what they're supposed to be doing. But the same thing should be done on the agricultural level. So, and President Ramaphosa in his SONA of 2022, in February 2022, said specifically that the only way that this country will get back to its former glory with regard to economic growth and job creation is if the private sector becomes more involved. And some eyebrows were raised, amongst some of his colleagues. But that's the truth. That's the simple truth. I don't have to tell the viewers that the difference in the quality of delivery of standards and services in this country between the private sector and the public sector is like night and day, that difference. But by working together, we can certainly get there. But then they must listen to the private sector, and before they enact legislation that is designed to harm a specific sector, like the New Water Act, to do a macroeconomic impact assessment, which apparently they don't worry about. They have to look at the economic consequences of whatever laws are being passed through Parliament and start singling out agriculture, because as I said earlier, and we all agree on that, there is no substitute for food. If a country has the type of problems that we have, socially, economically, and you also are a net importer of food, then you have serious potential problems with regard to socio-political unrest. We don't have that. We're a huge net exporter of food, but we should stabilize and maintain that position.
Yeah, I've still got one or two other points or problems we're facing as far as agriculture and job creation is concerned. Just very briefly, your input and reaction on what Dr. Roelof said.
No, I think it's important not to paint a sort of a doom and gloom picture. There are huge challenges, absolutely, but these are challenges that can definitely be overcome. And some of them, I would almost say, with proper partnerships between government and business, as Doc has mentioned, it can be done. we consume more energy than we produce. So there's a market there. It's not like our economy has slowed down to the extent that we don't have a demand for energy. Likewise with logistics. So as soon as you liberalize those markets and allow private sector generation, okay, there is infrastructure, etc., for transmission that needs to come in place, and with the logistics, it's the same. The private sector will very quickly make up that difference. I think the sort of shining light of the good thing is through a combination of several factors. I mean, it's entrepreneurial spirit, it's adoption of biotechnology. We are competitive in many spaces, in many value chains. You know, we are world leading in many of these value chains in spite of the challenges. So I think that gives me hope that if we can resolve some of these challenges, and I think it is certainly possible to do so, that the sector can grow quite significantly. It's we don't face the same challenges that maybe inherent challenges that maybe some island nations and other nations face. So it really, a lot of our challenges are self-made, and we can resolve these challenges. Some of the other challenges, of course, what's happening in the geopolitical space internationally, those are slightly tougher to
Does something like the problems in the Ukraine have an effect on agriculture and on job creation at all? Does it affect? Would you like to very briefly?
I can say it's more of an, like Theo said, I think we are in agreement on many things here. Look, at the end of the day, it comes down to the balance sheet. If you are in a country that is geopolitically positioned to strengthen the farming, agricultural sector, and you have trade agreements, exporting especially, and if you are endangering that in any way, you are going to feel the heat in some form or other. And that will mean that if I cannot export as much as I should be exporting, that means the following year, like I said, the statistics of labor are lagging in some respects. Some things you see later after they've happened, and then you attributing it to that period, but actually you experience a windfall of a commodity that was grown 5 or 3 years ago, and you thinking that, oh wow, South Africa is doing great, but actually you have to take those sort of things into consideration. So maybe we might not see the effect now, maybe in 2 years' time, or maybe in a year's time, especially because now there's this discussion about AGOA, whether or not, the US thinks that South Africa should actually continue benefiting, because the latest stats in 2019, they don't have anything on their website right now. If you look at the United States international representatives, they were actually discussing the fact that at some point South Africa was actually exporting certain things, and they were in deficit in terms of the South African relationship, I think in $1.3 billion, which means South Africa actually in that sort of relationship that particular year did benefit from that. But that does not mean to say that, like Theo said, it's all doom and gloom. Maybe what we can look for is to say, if there are trade and economics, if we can fix our own problems internally, we can just become more attractive to other maybe investments. So I do think there is something that we could get affected by, but I don't think necessarily that we can say that, okay, now we have no alternative. But I do think it's something we should work on. Definitely, something we should work on.
Right, closing remark from you, Theo, and then Doc.
I think that there's a number of things we need to focus on. Obviously, the energy and logistics thing should have been addressed, 5-10 years ago, but it's not too late to do it now. That's my sort of feeling. I think some of the other aspects we definitely need to focus on if we want to maintain this growth. It cuts across various different sectors, but if you just look at horticulture and the percentage of that's exported, it's an industry that's still growing in terms of volume terms, and the plantings that have taken place means between now and 2035 it's going to grow. So the real focus has to be to find and to sustain this growth, to find markets for South African products. I think that's a very important element. There's the traditional markets, but also opening up new markets.
Doc?
Yes, it's interesting that a number of large companies that are directly and indirectly involved with agriculture have recently warned government that their stance towards Russia, which is not neutral, is endangering their future. Not only with regard to exports, but also with regard to imports of intermediate inputs and components. Think fertilizer, for instance, just as one example. And this is incredible that our government is actually seen as being overly friendly towards Russia. The Ukraine is a sovereign, independent, free enterprise democracy. Russia is a effective dictatorship that went in there militarily. The Russians that have died in this war are soldiers or they are the Wagner, they are mercenaries. The people that die in Ukraine include babies. I cannot believe that our government hasn't clinically said, no more Russia. Get out of BRICS as far as I'm concerned. We've got our total exports. Our exports to Russia as a percentage of our total exports, 0.2%. They are only interested in our membership of that anti-America club. And this government must think very deep and hard about their relationship with two communist dictatorships, China and Russia. It is irritating a lot of South Africans in this country that have skills, that have business interests, and that have assets.
And at the end of the day, this will all have an impact on job creation in agriculture.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on our discussion regarding agriculture and job creation. I think that this needs a follow-up. Until next time.